Okay, chapter 11. Virtually this entire chapter deals with the death and resurrection of Lazarus. This is a critical turning point in Jesus' ministry. Arguably his greatest miracle seals his death sentence, as we will see. Let me read the first 16 verses here. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death, for it is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this he said to his disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to him, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I will go to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest and sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. The Greek word, one of the Greek words for life, is Zoe. It is the Greek root from which we get the word zoology, for instance. And it is one of the distinctive themes in John's Gospel, a word that occurs some 38 times in the Gospel. To give you a point of comparison, that same word only shows up 7 times in Matthew, 4 times in Mark, and 5 times in Luke. So clearly, it is a big emphasis for John. From the earliest verses of John, we see references to life. In him was life, and the life was the light of men, John 1:4. In speaking to Nicodemus in 3:16, he promised him eternal life. Jesus referred to himself as the bread of life in 6:35. People do not have life in themselves, they must receive it from the outside. Jesus is the one having words that impart life in 6:68. He came to infuse life. Chapter 10, verse 10. He gives life to those who trust him. Chapter 10, verse 28. Over and over and over again. And in chapter 11, Jesus is seen to be the resurrection and the life. This is where he demonstrates his power over what Paul referred to in 1 Corinthians 15:26 as the last enemy, death. And he demonstrates that power in an incredibly dramatic way. I mean, of all the events in the Gospels, there are only a few that compare with the sheer drama of what happens in chapter 11. In the last part of John's Gospel, in chapter 20, verse 31, he says that his goal for us as readers is that we might believe, is that by believing you might have life in his name. And in this chapter is one of those most powerful supports in the account of how Jesus raised and restored Lazarus not only from death, but also from bodily deterioration after 4 days in the tomb. Jesus' actions in this chapter also foreshadow the display of resurrection power that God will demonstrate when he raises his Son from the dead. Let's remember the setting. We're talking about events that happened right after Jesus fled Jerusalem, basically for his life. The authorities wanted to kill him. And so he fled the area. It has only been a brief time since he left, a matter of a few weeks or maybe a month or two. And what calls him back to the basically the suburbs of Jerusalem, Bethany is only less than 2 miles from the city wall, was the sudden illness of Lazarus. Now, Lazarus, Mary, and Martha have not appeared in John's Gospel before this. Mary and Martha are mentioned in Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. And although he makes reference to it here in chapter 11, it's not until chapter 12 that Mary anoints Jesus' feet and wipes them with her hair. So he's sort of tipping his hands about what's coming. He's helping the reader remember, identify which Mary we're talking about. Because if you recall, in the Gospels, there are a lot of Marys that are mentioned. And it can get a little confusing without, a program. Lazarus, we don't know a lot about Lazarus. I mean, this one instance is basically where we learn what little we know about him. His name is a shortened form of the Hebrew name Eleazar. If you remember your Old Testament, he was Aaron's third son. So Lazarus is just an abbreviated form of Eleazar. Martha's name is Aramaic for lady. And Mary is a Greek form of an Aramaic word which is itself a derivative of the Hebrew word Miriam, which was Moses' older sister. These were clearly close friends of Jesus. They were people of some means. There's a number of indications that would lead us to believe that these are folks with a fair amount of money. For one thing is the nature of the tomb in which Lazarus is buried. Only the wealthy could afford these cave-type tombs with the stone that rolls across them. You remember, Jesus was buried in a rich man's grave. It was Joseph of Arimathea's grave that he ended up being buried in. Poor people couldn't afford this kind of this would be the equivalent today of somebody being buried in the family crypt, out there in the cemetery grounds, where you see one of those stone or concrete buildings where several generations of family members are entombed. Most people can't afford that kind of send-off. Well, Lazarus was clearly a person with some means. His family had money for him to have that kind of a burial. It has been widely suggested that Mary and Martha and Lazarus were among the people who helped support Jesus' ministry. I mean, you ever think about it? Here's Jesus and his band of followers traveling the countryside, going from town to town, village to village. They got to eat. There are certain necessities of life that they have to have, and it costs money. And there's no evidence that Jesus ever took up an offering when he preached. So somebody was paying the bills. The fishermen weren't catching any fish, so they couldn't help. Matthew wasn't collecting any taxes, so he couldn't help. So this was one of the families that may well have helped to support Jesus' public ministry. The language of John 11 indicates that that these were people close to Jesus. They were special friends. When Jesus, one of the questions that is not answered here is, how did they know where to get a hold of Jesus? Jesus doesn't have a regular mailing address. He's going from place to place. And this, again, is an indication that Mary and Martha and Lazarus had a special relationship because they knew where to send word. They apparently were in regular communication with Jesus so that they would know how to get a hold of him in a hurry. And so they sent word that Lazarus was ill. And Jesus does something that at face value is inexplicable. He does nothing. In fact, reading the text carefully suggests that he deliberately delays. This isn't a case of being providentially hindered. This is a case of sitting on your hands. He knows what's going on, and he makes a conscious, deliberate choice to do nothing. He is forcing the issue. He is waiting for his friend to die. Death would take place, but it would not have the last word. Jesus, and the language here is reminiscent of what we read earlier back in chapter 9 about the man born blind who Jesus gave his sight, restored his sight. It was done. His blindness was part of God's plan that Jesus' power might be demonstrated. Lazarus' death was part of God's plan that Jesus' power might be demonstrated to an even greater level. Now, for some modern people, this is troubling. It almost raises ethical questions in the minds of some, that God would manipulate circumstances and people in such a way. But we're asking questions that we don't have the standing to ask when we start meddling in why God does what. God has purposes that are above and beyond us. There's some things we just simply have to accept that God can do that you and I cannot. And that he has the greater good of all of us in mind when he allows things to happen. But it's not just an academic question, because we all experience things that we'd rather not experience. Sometimes we experience it in the teeth of our prayers. We're asking God specifically to spare us from things that he allows to happen. And sometimes we will come to a point where we'll understand God's purposes, and sometimes we will go to our graves not knowing. I would like to think that the day will come where we can hear from God's own lips why some of these things happen. But I have to, in all honesty, the Bible never promises us answers even then. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. It will depend on whether in God's judgment, we need to know. In matters of state security, stuff is compartmentalized on a need-to-know basis. Sometimes that can be a real frustration for the people involved. But need to know is a part of life, and sometimes it's a part of life beyond this life. So he intentionally delays. It's obvious from Jesus' actions that he's already got an end in mind when he hears what is going on with Lazarus. He already has a plan, and he's going to work that plan. And so he waits a couple days, and when he decides the time is right, he responds to the message, and he tells his followers, we have to go back to Judea. His announcement was not received cheerfully. This was not what they wanted to hear. The disciples reminded him of the hostility that he had barely escaped just a short time earlier. And their concern is almost certainly not just for Jesus, it's for their own skins. They are identified with Jesus. And when Jesus is swept up in an arrest, they've got pictures of that dragnet taking them all in. And none of them are wanting to commit suicide. None of them are wanting to die needlessly. So they're thinking tactically in a very pragmatic way. Jesus is thinking strategically. The issues of personal safety in the short term are of minor concern to him at this point. He has a bigger purpose in mind. He's not deterred by their fearfulness. He points out that they have, Jesus' point appears to have involved the light by which he walked. His comments here need some explanation. He says, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of the world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. Jesus' security is knowing that he is walking in the light of the Father's will. He is doing what the Father has commanded. And as long as he knows that, there's no reason to be afraid. Living as we do in an age in which the security that we may have once taken for granted seems a little precarious at times, that's an important reminder. As long as we are walking in the light of the Father's will, we need not be afraid. It would have been far more dangerous for Jesus to walk in the darkness of human counsel than in the light of the Father's will. If he had given heed to the fears of his followers, then he would have veered off that path that God had set for him, and that would have been catastrophic. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him that sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world. That's what he said back in chapter 9. So Jesus remained true to his purpose despite the well-intentioned, fearful counsel of his disciples. Jesus then sets forth to explain to his disciples what's going on. He uses this phrase, fallen asleep, to describe Lazarus' state. If you look at all the uses of that phrase in the New Testament, there are 4 times when it's talking about literal sleep. But there are 14 times when it is used figuratively to describe death. Remember what Paul said in 1 Corinthians when he was talking about the abuses of the Lord's Supper in the church? And he said, because of this, some of you have become sick and some have fallen asleep. Well, he's not talking about narcolepsy. He's talking about death. The disciples misunderstood him. Boy, you see that a lot with the disciples. They seem like they're constantly missing what he's trying to say. And so he stops speaking figuratively and he talks literally. Lazarus is dead. And then, again, he says something that, taken out of context, seems very troubling. Lazarus is dead, and I'm glad. For your sake, I'm glad I was not there. Which tells us a couple things. One, that Jesus recognizes a greater purpose is going to be accomplished by resurrecting Lazarus or resuscitating him, and I'll talk about the difference in a minute. And it also says, it implies that if Jesus had been there, he wouldn't have been able to restrain himself from healing Lazarus. I'm glad I wasn't there. So that's, and again, we see the tension of the divine human, the God-man. El Gabor, as Isaiah referred to this back in Isaiah chapter 9, the God-man, mighty God, as it's translated in English. He is very God and very man. All God, all man. In a unique blend that has never happened before and will never happen again. And we'll see some more of that tension as the story unfolds, as we see Jesus weeping at the grave of Lazarus. Jesus understood that what was going to happen was going to be an incredible boost to his disciples' faith. It's going to take it to a whole new level. They're going to see a demonstration of power unlike any they've seen before, and they're going to realize to a greater extent the nature of the one they're following. But it's going to be a difficult process to get there. Well, the disciples have learned that their protest can be lodged, but Jesus is the one who makes the final decision. And Jesus makes it plain. He is determined to go back to Judea, to the very shadows of the Jerusalem wall. And Thomas is the one who this time speaks up for the group. Usually it's Peter. And Thomas, who gets a lot of bad press because of the infamous Doubting Thomas episode after the resurrection, shows that he's a man of some personal courage. There's a sense of resignation in what he says, a sense of hopelessness. This is not going to end well, you can almost hear him saying. But we're in with Jesus to the end. We might as well go die with him. Maybe there's a sense of despair in this. What else are we going to do? We've cast our lots with Jesus. But there is no lack of courage here. And he sort of settles the issue for the group. Verse 17. Now when Jesus came, he found Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, 1.7 miles exactly. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him. But Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die." Do you believe this? She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." 4 days dead. The mourners are at the house. Every culture has its own traditions about death and dying and grief. And they vary widely from place to place. Joyce and I just the other day were talking about some friends of ours from the church I served in Appleton. And this couple had moved to Wisconsin from South Carolina. And they had not been there long when there was a death. I don't remember who had died. But they were stunned that the funeral home did not place a black wreath on the front door of the home. They lived their whole life in an area of South Carolina where that was the custom. And any time there was a death, the family that was most affected would display a black wreath on the door, just like in the movie Gone with the Wind, if you remember that scene where there's that black wreath. And it was an eye-opening experience for them to realize that was not the custom in Wisconsin. In fact, it's not the custom in most of the United States. But their world up until that point was limited enough that they assumed that what was true there was true everywhere. Well, there were some specific unique customs in first century Judaism about death. In the Talmud, it prescribes 7 days of deep mourning after a death, followed by 30 days of light mourning. If you have ever had a close friend who is an observant Jew, you may have encountered the practice of sitting Shiva. It was where the folks gathered with the family and sat with them during this time of mourning. It's not that different from many of our own customs. When there's a death of someone close, people, the bereaved want to have people around them most of the time. They may not want to talk to you, but they don't want to sit in the room empty. One of the other customs that was commonplace for those who could afford it was to hire professional mourners, which really seems strange to us today. But these were the people who would come in and provide the backdrop of crying that, lest you forget why you're there, I guess. Now, we don't know if these are professional mourners that are involved here or not, but they may well have been, along with just family and friends and neighbors who are there grieving with Mary and Martha, just as we would expect. When it mentions here, many of the Jews had come to Mary and Martha. Now, I've mentioned to you before that typically when we see that phrase, the Jews, in the Gospels, particularly in John's Gospel, he's specifically talking about the high priest and the Pharisees and the other opponents of Jesus. In this context, you shouldn't read any theological meaning behind this. He's just talking about Judeans at this point. So these are not the Jews, the enemies of Jesus. They're just the Jews, the people who lived around Mary and Martha. Martha first expressed her conviction that had Jesus not been so long in coming, Lazarus would not have died. Now, maybe there is a mild rebuke here, maybe not. We really can't say with confidence. You could read it that way. Jesus, if you'd just gotten here quicker, we wouldn't be going through this. Or it could have been simply an expression of her faith in Jesus' power. It's such a shame you weren't here, because if you had been, you could have healed him. And so you can read it either way. There's no way to know for certain which way it was intended. Likewise, don't read into the fact that Martha comes out to greet Jesus and Mary doesn't. I've heard people speculate that Mary was upset with Jesus and so she didn't go out there when the word came. We don't know that Mary even knew Jesus was there. In fact, her response when Martha sends for her suggests that she didn't. Again, think about the context. This is a house in mourning. Normally, in such a situation, people don't raise their voices unless they're crying out loud. Voices are subdued. People come and they whisper to one another. And so you imagine those circumstances. A messenger comes with the word that Jesus is approaching. Now, everybody in that house would have known about the relationship that Mary and Martha and Lazarus had with Jesus. And so they would have known this is information that they would want to know right away. We don't even know if Mary and Martha are in the same part of the house. And so the way I picture this, somebody comes up to Martha and whispers in her ear, Jesus is on his way. And so she drops everything and heads out there, knowing that she can call Mary later. She is taking on the responsibility of the hostess here. And she's there to greet their dear friend. So she has this brief conversation with Jesus. And then she says, but even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Again, don't read into this more than is there. You really can't support the notion that Martha is suggesting in this that she believes Jesus has the power to raise Lazarus from the dead. Remember, that would be unprecedented, at least in this circumstance. Now, there are a few other instances where Jesus restores to life someone who's died. But in every other case, it is, a matter of minutes or an hour or so. It is not somebody who's been dead and buried for 4 days. Lazarus' body has started to decay by this point. And there is nothing in Jesus' ministry or in any of the ministry of the prophets of old. Elisha and Elijah in their greatest days had never done anything like what Jesus was about to do with Lazarus. So, yes, she's expressing her confidence and faith in Jesus. She recognizes him for who he is. But this is going to go to a whole nother level with what's about to transpire. Jesus now presses the point. Your brother will rise again. Martha says, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Her response was what you would have expected to Jesus' statement. It was an affirmation of faith in the resurrection that would come. And it would have been perfectly understandable if she had interpreted Jesus' comment at this point to be referencing that latter-day resurrection. But in fact, what Jesus said had a double meaning. Yes, Lazarus would be resurrected on the last day. But far more immediately, he would be resuscitated. Theologians distinguish between the two terms. Resurrection, as the term is applied to Christian theology, speaks not only of coming back to life, but coming back to life with that resurrection body like Jesus has on Easter Sunday. A body that is immune from death and disease and pain and all the limitations of this current flesh. Lazarus does not experience resurrection on this day. He is simply restored to the place he was before he got sick. But it's still the same old body with the same limitations. Jesus has just pumped fresh life into it. So that's an important point to distinguish when we talk about this. And although we use the term resurrection of Lazarus all the time, it's technically a misuse of resurrection. It's the resuscitation of Lazarus that we're talking about. He who hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life and will not be condemned. He has crossed from death to life. That's what Jesus said back in chapter 5, verse 24. And now he's pressing Martha. Do you really believe this? And Martha's response is admirable. and it's insightful. Jesus is the Messiah. He is God's appointed envoy who will bring about the promises of God. With such a depth of understanding, it's no wonder that she continued to honor Jesus even in the midst of fresh grief. But there's no indication in all this that her grief and sadness have been lessened 1 degree in all this. And again, we're all at times called upon to offer consolation to somebody who is grieving. And what we have to remember is our expressions of faith and our efforts to bolster the faith of the bereaved, while well-intentioned and may be appropriate depending on the circumstances, are not going to lessen their grief. The fact that you know that your beloved loved one is in heaven and that you will be restored to them takes some of the sting of death away. But it doesn't change the fact that you're separated from them now. And that pain is still just as real. And as long as Martha is thinking about her brother's future resurrection, it doesn't do anything to ease the pain of the current separation. Verse 28. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying?" Martha got word to Mary that Jesus was in the area and that he wanted to see her. Mary immediately dropped what she was doing and went racing to where Jesus was. He's somewhere out on the edge of the village. She falls at his feet, weeping, and echoes the words of her sister, "Jesus, if you'd just been here." Again, you can read into this a mild rebuke or not. The context really doesn't make that clear. The mourners in the house, and again, these may be professional mourners or friends or some combination thereof, and most likely, followed her out, assuming she was going to the tomb to weep. And again, this would be typical grief practices in the customs of the day. But instead, she went to Jesus. In verse 33, it says, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and greatly troubled. The Greek verb that's translated deeply moved only shows up 4 times in the New Testament. It's a reminder of Jesus' deep empathy for those he came to save. We're reminded of the words of Hebrews 4:15 when it says, "We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness." It also says that Jesus was troubled. This word denotes an internal agitation and anguish. It can even indicate visible shuddering or shaking. It's also used of Jesus in chapter 12, verse 27, and in 13:21. It again is a reminder of Jesus' humanity. He is caught up in the grief of the moment. He's identifying with mankind even as he prepares to lay down his life for them. When Jesus sought the whereabouts of the tomb, it was not Mary but the mourners who answered for her. It may well be that at this point Mary was too overcome to talk. It's very easy to picture her just sobbing uncontrollably at this point. John doesn't say why Jesus wept. The word probably denotes discreet shedding of tears, whereas the word used in verse 33 normally means a loud lament or loud weeping. But if John is trying to suggest a difference here, he doesn't explain himself. The mourners standing around are struck by what they see. They're struck by the depth of feeling that Jesus shows. They're struck by his affection for Lazarus. Jesus gives us here a practical example of something that he tells us in chapter 13, verse 35, where he said, "By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have loved one another." Jesus demonstrates what it means to love one another. Some of those there apparently found fault with what Jesus was doing. Maybe they had witnessed the healing of the blind man's sight, and they're sort of saying to themselves, well, if he's such a good friend to these people, why wasn't he here? As Jesus actually walks up to the tomb, he is once more shaken. We get to verse 38. Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, by this time there'll be an odor, for he's been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, Did I not tell you that if you believed you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you have sent me." Then when he said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And the man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Verse 38 repeats the image of Jesus deeply moved, caught up in the grief. And this may well be just a natural human response to actually seeing the tomb of his dear friend. It has been suggested by some scholars that Jesus' emotion was not so much one of grief as stern indignation, just outrage at the ugly reality of death in God's creation. That may be. We can't presume to know exactly what's going on in Jesus' mind at this point. What we do know is with a deep sense of resolve and premeditation, he commands, "Take away the stone." And Martha, being the one who is always trying to take care of things, the one with the gift of helps run amok, the one who's always making sure that everybody's comfortable and all the niceties are being taken care of. While Mary's at the feet of Jesus listening, Martha's making sure everybody's plate's full. And she's horrified. She's got this image of this stone being rolled back and the stench of decay wafting out of that cave. And she was exactly right. We must not lose sight of the fact that when that tomb was opened, that stench came billowing out. Because what Jesus did in resuscitating Lazarus doesn't change the fact that for 3 days his corpse has been rotting in this tomb. And while he restores him, the lingering smell of death would have been overwhelming as that stone was rolled back. And it simply would have reinforced the incredible miracle that took place. There was no doubt that this man had been dead when that stone was rolled back. Chances are this tomb, very similar to the one in which Jesus was laid, would have been a shallow cave, either a natural cave or a man-made one. Both exist in ancient Palestine. And if it was indeed a natural cave, then in all likelihood in the back part of it they had carved out a spot to form a ledge on which the body could be laid. In fact, what was typical practice in these cave tombs is the body would be left there for a year or so until all the soft tissue had completely rotted away. And then the bones would be collected and put in some kind of a earthen jar and placed on a shelf there in the tomb, and then the platform would be available for the next family member who died. So that after years and years, the tomb would eventually fill up with these earthenware jars filled with bones, the ossuaries they called them. So that was the typical practice. And we don't know, this tomb may well have been filled with the bones of past family members at this point. We really have no way of knowing. There's no indication it was a new tomb, though. The glory of which Jesus speaks in verse 40 is explicitly mentioned in verse 4 and implied in Jesus' earlier exchange with Martha. Go back to verse 4. It says, "But when Jesus heard this, he said, 'This illness does not lead to death, for it is for the glory of God.'" And now again he repeats that word glory. Glory in this setting refers to the powerful personal presence of God Almighty. It's the word in the Hebrew Shekinah, the dwelling place of God, where God is in our midst. For God, who was present in Jesus, gives life to the dead and calls things that are not as though they were. Romans 4:17. Jesus clearly has an inner assurance about what God is about to do as he commands the stone be moved. He thanks God in advance for what's about to happen. John stresses the fact that Jesus' command went forth with a loud, forceful shout. Jesus wanted to make sure that everybody present heard what he had just said. "Lazarus, come forth!" And then in a scene that we would associate with a cheap horror movie, this body bound up in strips of linen cloth comes hopping out of the grave. Literally hopping, because his feet were bound. And I have this image of this crowd around the grave wondering, what in the world is this crazy preacher doing? First they get the stench coming out of there, which kind of sets them back a foot or two. And then they see this dead man staggering out of the tomb, and I suspect that they gave him a big, wide berth at this point. And Jesus has to command them, unbind him. And at this point, people went from puzzlement to horror to awe. And I suspect more than a few fell to the ground in worship. This clumsy, staggering, lumbering would-be corpse wanting loosed. Remember what Jesus said in chapter 5, verse 25? A time is coming and has now come when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad, so that from that day on they made plans to put him to death. Jesus therefore no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness to a town called Ephraim, and there he stayed with his disciples. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. And they were looking for Jesus, saying to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think? Will he not come to the feast at all?" Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should let them know so that they might arrest him. It's certainly not surprising that people were moved and awed by what Jesus did. It is not surprising that they would have come to a new faith in this preacher from Galilee and begin to understand that he truly was the Messiah. But not everybody responded that way. It's a pattern we see throughout John's Gospel. When Jesus performs some mighty work, some sign, when he teaches some profound concept, there are those that receive it gladly with faith, and there are those who reject it out of hand. Some believed, some scurried off to the Pharisees to tell on him. This precipitated an emergency meeting of the Jewish high court in Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is a group composed of about 70 men. The majority of them were Sadducees. Many of these were among the high priests, the leaders of the temple. An important minority was made up of Pharisees. These two religious political parties were frequently at one another's throats. They had some profound differences of opinion on a number of important issues. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. They didn't believe in angels. They rejected all the Old Testament except for the first 5 books of the law, the Torah. The others they did not accept as scripture. It was the Pharisees who were the primary leaders of the synagogues out in the villages and small towns, but it was the Sadducees who controlled the temple. But the one thing they seemed to be able to agree on was they all hated Jesus. And they were alarmed. The Sadducees in particular were alarmed. These were the Jewish power brokers. These were the guys who had quietly cut deals with the Romans so that they could exercise power under Rome's domination. And it was in their vested interest to keep the peace. Because the Sanhedrin was not just a religious court, it was a civil court as well. And for the most part, the Jews lived out their days under the authority and under the rule of the Sanhedrin. Only on limited issues, such as a capital offense or failure to pay taxes or some kind of insurrection or something, did the Roman authorities get involved. They were more than happy to let the Jews take care of the Jews. And the fewer Romans involved in all of this, the happier they were, so long as the peace was kept and the taxes got paid on time. The Sanhedrin looked at what was going on and said, this is getting out of hand. This man is doing stuff that is swaying the crowds. If they all go after him, if they proclaim him king and Messiah, the Romans are going to act. And not only are we going to lose our cushy jobs, the whole nation is going to come under oppressive Roman rule. And this situation with Lazarus was only going to make things worse. In fact, Lazarus himself became a wanted man before this was all over. And then Caiaphas, the high priest, made a pronouncement. Caiaphas served as high priest from 18 AD to 36 AD. He was the high priest this particular year. And John notes the irony of what Caiaphas says. What he said had one meaning for him, but it had a much deeper, more profound meaning through the inspiration of God. Caiaphas is prophesying without even knowing that he's prophesying. And he ends up predicting that Jesus was going to die for the nation and ultimately for the world. All of this served to drive Jesus and his followers underground again. They headed out of Judea. They went to a remote place not far from where John had been baptizing at an earlier time. And they marked time for a while as Jesus prepares for the final culmination of his ministry. The stage has now been set. The triumphal entry, the prediction of his death by crucifixion, the final public appeal, all that lies in the chapters just ahead. Jesus has demonstrated his confidence that the Father would protect him, that he would deliver him, that the eternal sacrifice for the sins of the world that he was on earth to accomplish would happen. And now he is on the doorstep of his final and most severe test. And that concludes chapter 11.